there was a reviewer, and I started to read reviews of the book, and then I said, forget this. There was just way too many. But there was a reviewer in the New York Times that said this was the book that you were born to write. So my question is, were you born to also live with this book?
Apparently.
Because you wrote it a couple years ago.
Yeah.
You worked on it for over a decade, but it came out, a couple years ago. And ever since, and I would guess actually for years to come, this is a book that, and a family that you are going to be forever identified with. So talk about what it's been like to live with the book.
Yeah, to answer the question of whether I was born to sort of have this book take over my life and be my life sort of indefinitely, the Lax family has an opinion about that, particularly Deborah Lax, who's sort of one of the main characters in the book. She's Henrietta's daughter, and she was the one who was the most sort of emotionally affected by the story of the cells. And the one little bit of the story was also that her children were used in research without their knowledge later in order to try and learn about the cells. So Deborah was used in research. There was a lot of fear and a lot of emotions. And part of what got her through it all was that she came to believe that Henrietta had been chosen as the world's first immortal being, and basically brought back to life as an angel to take care of people and cure diseases and occasionally cause problems if you made her mad. And so as part of that, once I eventually got the family to trust me, which took
years.
Years, for good reason. I mean, they had a lot of reasons not to trust me, but or anyone. But once I finally won their trust, Deborah in particular kind of came to believe that I had been chosen by Henrietta at a very early age, and essentially that she'd been working me like a puppet my entire life to go and write this book.
And you're as secular as they come.
Right. Right. I am a completely, raised in a very much non-religious, scientific, I was trained as a scientist, and this was an interesting challenge between the two of us. And so yeah, she, her view of this was that Henrietta had sort of been like, go over here and study science, go over here and study writing. And so Deborah's answer to your question would be like, well, duh, yes, this is what she was actually chosen to do, this is what she was born to do. And yeah, I kind of, at a certain point, got to a place where I was like, yep, I can't argue with that. Like, so many strange things have happened along the way that made it feel like, yeah, this is just sort of what, I had to do from a very early age. But in terms of it sort of still happening, I mean, this is something that when I started working on the book, I had no idea. It would take me about 11 years to research and write it. And then it came out, and in the world of publishing these days, basically, when you're finished writing the book is when a lot of your new job starts, which is that you're then a publicist, and you then do full-time work trying to support the book. So then it came out in 2010, and I started doing the publicity for it in 2009. So, I've been doing years worth of publicity really full-time.
You're on the road constantly.
And more so than, I was sort of like the poster child for author self-publicity for a while because I organized my own book tour. I had myself booked. I did over 350 events the first year the book came out of public speaking, and often
That's
multiple events in one day. Totally insane to do.
You should just tour with like a band.
I used to have this fantasy before I actually finished writing the book. This just, I was tortured by having to get the book out eventually of my head, and I would have this recurring dream that I had a bus that was covered in cells, and I would go on tour around the country, and I would go into these huge, like amphitheater stadium places and have a big microphone with a squishy, wind cover thing on it, and I would just tell the story of the book. So I didn't have to write it. And because I was like, I got to get the story out, but writing it's really hard. I'd much rather just tell people. And so I had this, and I used to joke about it. This was like the recurring dream. And then that's basically what's happened. Jumbotrons and everything. And, it's funny. Eric Schlosser, who wrote Fast Food Nation, I met him not long before the book came out, and he heard about the story of it. And he said to me, you do realize you are always going to be the person who wrote this book. And, Eric Schlosser, who wrote Fast Food Nation in the 90s and has written, since and has done a lot of other things, is still traveling, talking about Fast Food Nation.
The difference would be with him, he's talking, you're both talking about topics that you are passionate about, but you, unlike him, and maybe he has his other things that he has to carry, you in some way have a responsibility toward a family.
Right.
So, and at a certain point when you're writing the book, at what point in writing the book did you realize, wait a minute, I'm not telling a story just for the sake of telling a story. I'm not telling a story that I think is important. I'm doing something else. I'm actually becoming a part of people's lives who will depend on me in some ways and will also be affected by what I say or don't say.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I came to writing as a science major. I had taken no journalism classes, and so I started really fumbling through this, not really knowing a whole lot about journalism and how to do it. And I think that there's a certain point in the book where part of how I won the family's trust was I told Deborah, you can come travel with me. I'm not trying to hide anything from you, which is what had been happening for a long time with a lot of people. And I said, you can come with me when I do my research. We'll learn about your mother together. We both sort of want the same thing, which is to find out what happened and to get this story out there. And I don't think I ever thought she would actually say yes, but she did. And so we started traveling together. And there's this point that's sort of like the climax of the book in a lot of ways, where we're on this trip and several things happen in very quick succession. And the first is that we go and she gets to see her mother's cells for the first time, alive under a microscope, and she talks to them, and they are her mother. They aren't just these cells. And it was an incredibly emotional experience for her. And then the next morning we went to this mental institution, which had been formerly called the Home for Crazy Negroes, which was a place where her sister had been institutionalized when Henrietta died, and her sister was epileptic and deaf. And no one could really knew what to do with her. And so they institutionalized her, which was very common. And she died when she was 15. Deborah didn't know she had a sister.
And they did just absolutely atrocious things to her and to many other people there.
They did sort of unthinkable things to her. She was used in research completely unrelated to the HeLa cell story that was in a lot of ways much more barbaric than whatever happened to Henrietta or the rest of the family. And Deborah just sort of always knew something happened to my sister. And for Deborah, so much of the story was about women and the power of women in your lives. What happens when you lose a mother, and what happens when you don't have a big sister around. And for her, it was about finding out what happened to these women as a way of helping them sort of rest in peace, in a sense. And so she was determined to learn what happened to her sister. So we went to this institution, and I said, okay, well, we'll try to find out. And what we found was just so beyond what we could have imagined and so traumatizing. And also sort of there's this almost supernatural element that runs throughout the book of things happening that just sort of almost can't be explained. Like all of the medical records at this institution had been destroyed, except, a couple little books.
Did that change you in any way? These things happening, these coincidences happening?
Yeah, at a certain point, they definitely did. And I'll come back to that. But in terms of
the moment when
Are you a
priest now or a reverend?
Yes. The number of people at every event that I do, which is a lot of them, somebody comes up to me and says, "So were you saved?"
Oh, no.
And the answer is no, I wasn't. But
there's always time.
There is always time. But it did teach me, it really taught me a lot about faith and religion and the ways that faith can help people be open to science. Because what I saw was the very positive ways that faith helped the Lax family get through this. And really, that comes back to your question about when I knew that I was writing a book that I was entering into this relationship with this family. So we're in this hospital. Some of these medical records that were thrown in front of us, which also had photos, were just unbelievable and traumatizing. And I don't think either of us had even imagined how dangerous this could be for her. She had high blood pressure, she had diabetes, and what we learned, the combination of the excitement of seeing her mother's cells for the first time, sort of the trauma of some of the information we learned, she really almost had a stroke while we were doing the research, and she just sort of started spiraling. And then, this trip continues to go on, and one of the things that happens is one of her cousins sort of recognizes something very bad is happening here, and he starts doing this faith healing, and he's singing and praying, and Lord, you got to take the burden of the cells from this woman. He's sort of laying on hands, and then he turns to me and he says, you got to give them to her, and he sticks his hands on either side of my head, and he's like, ugh. And it's sort of like an exorcism of the cells from Deborah into me. And that was definitely the moment where I was like, okay, I'm much more a part of this than I really ever thought I was. But the moment of seeing Deborah start to really physically spiral, and she was having a really intense, dangerous reaction. That was the moment that I really realized this story, is about a lot of different things, and one of them is the impact of journalism on people and what it means to find your story, to have people tell your story. A lot of other journalists had come along before me, and their story was in the book, so I sort of ended up putting that in there as part of that.
No, you can tell in the book that that's the part of the story where and it might have happened before this too, where you go from saying, wow, in your mind, I've got a great story on my hands, and I care about these people and I care about the subject, but I'm also a journalist and I understand that this is amazing. I'm going to have a great book. To, wait a minute, this is real. This is a real deal. This is real.
Yeah, and I think it had been building towards that for a while, and I think my mission in it was I felt like there were a lot of important issues that are still relevant today about informed consent and science and class and access to medical care, and I was thinking about a lot of those big issues while I was working on it, but and I was concerned about the family, and I was always very open with them, and we talked a lot about what will it mean when the book comes out. It may mean that no one reads it, and we just spent the last decade doing this and nobody cares. Or everybody might read it, and they might try to call you at home and tell you that they've seen your mother walking down the street. You
Sure.
just sort of never know. And so we talked about a lot of those possibilities. But that was definitely the first moment where it hit me that this was a much bigger responsibility came with the research process, not just the writing.
I want to switch gears just a bit, and that's that there's a moment in your book where you talk about when you were first introduced to the HeLa cells, and it's a science teacher, who mentions it very briefly in passing in high school. And the moment is that you mentioned that you're at an alternative high school because you were kicked out or flunked out of your first high school. So talk about getting to the point where you could write the book. Were you, I don't know what the scientific term for it is, but were you a fuck up as a child?
I believe that is a scientific term, and
Yeah.
I definitely was. I don't know if I was a fuck up, but I was trouble. I was a problem child. And my one of the questions that I often get about the book is like, why did you keep going? Like all these years and all these people trying to stop you and crazy things happening, and like the publishing industry story behind the cells book is ridiculous. And my parents come to these events and they hear this question often, and they're like, the side of you that wouldn't give up on this book was such a pain in the ass when you were a kid. Because I was just sort of very hard-headed, and I want to do things the way I want to do things, and which often led to me getting in a lot of trouble at school. And so the first time I was kicked out of school, I was in preschool.
Okay. What's the story?
Well, I was kicked out for refusing to nap.
Sure.
I'm not a napper.
Yeah.
I've never been a napper, and my teacher, I think it was a little more, that's probably an oversimplification, but my teacher then tried to force me to nap and locked me in a room, and I destroyed her antique oak bed with a paper clip, like carved her oak
3
bed.
years old.
Yeah, preschool.
Yeah.
So I got the nickname Rebecca at that point.
Okay.
And then it just sort of never got better than that. I'm in second grade. My teacher, I was actually born in Springfield, Illinois. So this was at a grade school in Springfield. I was, my teacher I had to make up these little cards, and at the end of every day I'd have to go to the teacher. And there was 2 cards, and one said Becca was good today, and one said Becca was bad today. And in order to graduate and go on to the 3rd grade, I had to have a number of Becca was good todays. And I did the math in my head, and I knew how many I needed, and I got exactly that number. And so I was sort of that kind of child, and I got kicked out of school in the 5th grade, and then and so it was just sort of on elaborate, strange.
Now, did your parents have to move around to find schools?
Yeah. They just moved in school. They moved schools. And yeah, I mean, there was definitely I was thinking about this morning actually. When I was in 5th grade, I think the strangest getting kicked out of school story was I was in 5th grade, and I was at this point had been moved from school to school, and I was in this little private school that was on the grounds of an old of a halfway house for some sort of low-level criminals who then did all the grounds work. So they would all wear these bright orange suits, and they were
you
cuffed.
switched sides over to be one of them.
This is just more setting the scene.
Okay, all right.
And it was an old monastery, I think, and for some, it was
sounds
a
like
very
the
small
creepiest. You've just
school. It was
described
very
the
creepy.
creepiest possible scenario.
And it was apparently in a very bad neighborhood in Springfield, which I have no idea where that might have been, but
where the Lincoln boys used to roam.
Right. And they and somehow the classes were very small. They were like split 5th, 6th grade, and there were 12 kids total in that class. So it was very tiny. And I somehow convinced the substitute teacher that we were allowed to leave campus for lunch. And I took the entire 5th, 6th grade class off campus in this neighborhood I'd never been in. It was very dangerous, and we were surrounded by criminals who were doing the grounds work, and somehow got them to a Chinese restaurant nearby and went in and ordered entire meals, food for everybody. And then at that point, of course, there's like search parties going around the neighborhood, and then someone actually came in this restaurant, a parent, and I saw them, and I went and I climbed out the window and ran off. And I mean, I was like, And it was just, I was
so
bored.
it wasn't you were never a fuck up in terms of like drugs or alcohol.
Well, I was
you did
that too, but that was later. But it was more that, I was a sort of smart kid who just had very specific ideas about what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do, and both in like recreationally and in terms of what I wanted to learn. And so I would just didn't work well in these schools, and so I bounced from school to school. We eventually moved to the West Coast, where I grew up in Portland, Oregon. And then that was when my freshman year, when I was 16, was when it all sort of came to a head. I just stopped going completely my freshman year, and I would divide my time between hanging out at Powell's bookstore and Forest Park, which is this enormous park in Portland. And then I would go to school at this alternative school where a bunch of my friends went that I thought was a cool school. And I wasn't enrolled there, and it was this sort of weird hippie school, and they didn't realize I wasn't enrolled.
Yeah.
And so I just spent an entire school year going to a different school. And so then I completely failed my entire freshman year.
They wouldn't give you credit for the school.
They didn't give me credit for that one.
Did you do the writing assignments and
everything?
Everything? Okay, all right.
And then,
what about your parents? Now, I heard a story.
Yeah.
I heard a story that on the beginning, when you would register for school, what you would do is your mom or dad were supposed to do it, but you knew. I'm thinking ahead. You would write out. You would register in your handwriting, which then they obviously thought was your parents' handwriting or mom's handwriting.
I was
and
the
then
signature of record.
Then when it came time to skip school, you could just sign it and they wouldn't question that you were forging it because that's the only handwriting they had. Is that true?
Yes, this is true.
Okay.
Yes. Right, so my parents didn't really know a lot of this was going on, but I mean, they knew that I wanted to go to this other school. I had been trying to convince them, but my dad was, his line was that was the school kids got remanded to. It was sort of one step before juvenile detention hall. And but then once I actually failed entirely my freshman year and they realized I was going to this other school anyways, then he was like, okay, fine. And then everything changed for me. And so at that school, their whole thing was you just set your own pace. And you could be here for 10 years if you want. You could be here for 2. And you set your own curriculum. And I really wanted to be a veterinarian. And so I created this curriculum for myself where I went to school at this high school, and then I went to night school at another local high school.
Lunch at the Chinese restaurant.
Lunch at the Chinese restaurant. And then I took classes at the local community college, in part because I'd realized, I was like, wait, you mean if I just go to school a lot for 1 year, I can leave? I can have a degree? And they said yes. So that was when I signed up for that class at this local community college. So I was 16 and in this community college class, and my teacher said, there are these amazing cells. And he just sort of said the basic gist of what they'd done for science. And it just grabbed me in a way that, this is part of the Henrietta had been guiding me thing that Deborah always believed, that I was just like, I must go.
Through all your years, through all your experience writing about science and writing about biology, have you ever got any insight into why your brain worked one way and a goody two-shoes brain would work the way they work? Why would somebody, like I have a son, he's 7 years old, and he's young, but he does not understand the concept of breaking rules.
Right.
And obviously at that point, you didn't understand the concept of obeying them.
Right.
So do you have any insight into why?
I don't.
No?
No, I don't. And my brother was the one who was always obeying the rules and then getting in trouble for me breaking the rules because he was supposed to be watching me. And no, I don't. And I mean, the only insight that it's interesting. I talk at schools all the time, at universities and stuff, and I often hear from students, parents, teachers, sort of saying like, "That's my kid," and that it's a.
My kid is going to write. My kid will write a bestseller someday.
Right. Well, then there's a sense of like, oh my God, there's hope. Yeah. But I think.
But for most people, they should know there is no hope.
I don't believe that.
I think
in my case, I think the fortunate thing was that my parents realized, they were like, she's gonna do what she's gonna do, so we gotta sort of harness that and let her, and they kind of try to guide her as much as we can through these into these places. And and just for me, it was about curiosity. I mean, so much of my problem in school was that I was just bored by a lot of what we were doing. And this moment when I learned about Henrietta cells, it just sparked something in me. And I went up to my teacher and I was like, well, what else do we know about her? And did she have any kids? And what do they think about these cells? And just rattling off all these questions. And he just said, hey, if you're curious, go do a little research, write up a little thing. I'll give you extra credit if you find anything. And I didn't then just go, I'm going to go become a writer and do this thing. I mean, I went and did some research, didn't find anything, and sort of that was it. But it just stuck, and it lit this sort of curiosity fire thing under me.
Real quick, because they're going to kick us out soon. But your next book, I know you're working on it, you're in the research phase, but just talk a little bit about it. It's about the relationship between people and animals.
It's it's very hard to explain, in part because I'm still in the early phases of it, but it's also very different from anything I've ever done. I mean, the first book was pretty easy to explain. There's this woman, this is what happened. And this book is much more complicated in some ways. So I did go through school and I worked for 10 years as a veterinary technician. And
did you work in a morgue?
I did. I worked
an animal morgue.
I worked in the veterinary morgue. I worked in veterinary emergency rooms. I spent a lot of, and I went through pre-vet, and I was going to go into vet school. And a lot of what I did along the way was just a lot of what I was exposed to started raising a lot of ethical questions for me. And there's sort of this moment, I think the moment I really kind of became a writer. My first writing class I took, I was my junior year, because I'd put off all my non-science required classes until the end. And for some reason, the school I went to counted creative writing as a foreign language. And so I signed up for my first creative writing class just to fulfill a sort of general ed requirement. And at that point, I was working in the morgue at the vet school. And we were supposed to write a story about a place. And the freezer in the morgue at the vet school was the place that I wrote about. And it was like the size of this room, refrigerated, with giant sort of industrial-sized pulleys hanging from the ceiling with cows and horses, and the walls were lined with these racks and things called gut buckets, which were filled with what you would imagine they were filled with. And I spent a lot of time in this little room dealing with all of this and sort of moving them around. And part of what I was seeing was the end result of all the teaching and research that was done at the hospital. And there they were using greyhounds from the local racetrack to teach students how to do surgeries, and they would end up dead at the end in the freezers, and a lot of different research projects that were going on. And so I started asking a lot of questions, like, really, this much per day is how many animals we go through just in this one school? And sort of how do you draw the line between what's really required for science and what's over the top? And then how do you sort of emotionally deal with that? I was getting attached to these animals I was working with, taking care of some of the research animals, and then they would end up in there. And sometimes I would see some of the awful things that they went through. And so I was this science person who was wrestling with a lot of these big ethical questions that come up when you deal with research on animals. And I didn't know where to put that. And so really the first story I ever wrote was me trying to wrestle with that question. And so this book goes back to that in a sense, and tells some personal stories, it turns out, about that as a way to sort of start tackling this big issue of sort of how do we draw these lines? And in some ways it's similar to the first book, that it's a science that everybody benefits from, right? Like, everybody in this room has benefited from Henrietta's death personally. Everybody in the world has. And same with animal research. Even the people who are adamantly anti-research on animals benefit regularly from this research. And I think people often don't realize where science impacts their daily life. And if you look back, most of the things I've written are about that, like trying to get people to see the places where they and science overlap.
Well, is there a timetable, or 5 years?
No, God.
Less?
Not another 10 years.
Yeah.
No, I don't have like a publication timetable, but much faster, hopefully, than the last one.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
We've got Rebecca's book, along with Homero's book, out for sale from the bookseller. Rebecca Skloot, everyone.
Thank you.